Hey everyone, welcome back. We are moving on to topic 1.4 of the AP World History curriculum. This is going to be state building in America. Now, for today's essential question, to what extent was state building in the Americas similar to that of Asia? And if you need to do a little review, I would pause this video, go back and review 1.1 and 1.3. All of those civilizations, both in East, South, and Southeast Asia, are relative to answering and comparing to this question. So keep in mind some of the things that we learned about in those previous lectures as you go forward with this one. So we're in the Americas, and to kind of build some context, that is, be a long amount of context. Number one, it's roughly 13,000 years ago in which the early Americans came to the Americas before they get cut off from the rest of the world because of the global warming that ended the ice age that raised the sea levels to where the bridge that they crossed over, Beringia, the space between modern-day Alaska and Russia, closed off, and they were cut off from the world, with the exception of the Vikings, who come for a short little stint, but essentially until 1492, right? So over the course of the time where they are completely separated from the rest of Afro-Eurasia, there is the majority of the tribes and civilizations that live in the Americas continue to practice essentially a Paleolithic lifestyle to a very large extent. So they're largely hunters and gatherers, and then they'll have some farming on the side as well, but the majority of their resources were provided by nature themselves. So as a result, their populations didn't grow to the extent that you see in the Asian, African, and European empires, European continents, I should better say. However, there were some civilizations that did practice agriculture, and one even practiced animal husbandry, the breeding of livestock. And so that is, something a couple of these civilizations we're going to talk about today in today's lecture, and where they were and how they state build, right? So despite this limitation on the amount of domesticated animals and the lack of interregional trade, kind of puts them behind the rest of the world in terms of technological advancements. And that is something that does play a role when the Europeans arrive starting in 1492, and why they were not able to fend off the settlers that were coming to take land that once belonged to them, that and disease, which we'll talk about later down the road. Okay. So in the Americas, this is, of course, the curriculum. So it's in red. In the Americas, and it is in Afro-Eurasia, state system demonstrated continuity, innovation, and diversity, and expanded in scope and reach. And it's a pretty broad statement. So we're going to be more specific in some examples that College Board wants us to talk to you about the civilizations that occur inside the Americas. Let's start with the Mayan city-states. So the Mayan city-states are found in what we call Mesoamerica. It's essentially modern-day Mexico, particularly along the Yucatan Peninsula right in here. And these Mayan city-states, there were roughly 40 to 50 of them in total, and they had populations ranging anywhere between 5 and 50,000 people. All approximately about 2 million in whole lived inside the Mayan city-states. Now, when we say city-states, they're not a united empire. They're not a centralized rule. It's all a completely decentralized government. Each one of these city-states have their own governments, their own social structures, their own economic specializations all together. But generally, the people who ruled over these city-states, most were the kings were male, and because of the nature of the religion, they were also viewed as divine in some sense, similar to how the Pharaoh of Egypt was viewed as essentially the God's representative on earth. And it's not entirely different from what you see in Mesoamerica. They had elite classes of people, particularly scribes, those who are reading and writing, priests who also administrate government jobs and so forth, government administration as well. It was very common for people to pay taxes in the form of service, and that it was required that they serve in the military as a means to protect their city-states, as well as to be able to cull resources from other city-states as well. And so warfare was quite common between them. As I mentioned, they're not a united front. They are competitors in a lot of ways. We lump them together in history because they have similar cultures, they have similar languages, and they're all generally in the same area, but they are not a united front. It's similar to the way the ancient Greeks were, where you had Athens and Sparta and many other city-states that were rivals more than they were allies in their history. So they fought each other and such to gain tribute from one another. The larger city-states would forced the smaller city-states to pay tribute in the form of goods and such, and also in the form of captives that would be used for human sacrifice. More on that in a bit. So the Mayan city-states, this religion that they are practicing is polytheistic. They believe in multiple gods. And they hold a number of ceremonies and festivals in a sense to either please the gods or pay tribute to the gods in some way, to keep the celestial bodies working the way they should and so forth. And so part of the ceremonies, are not entirely all of them, but some ceremonies required that they did human sacrifice. And the human sacrifices in a nutshell, the sacrifice would be brought to the top of these temples, where a priest with a knife would essentially cut into the person's chest, pull out the heart while it's still beating, and then cut the head off and kick it down the stairs and so forth, so that the blood would run out. And that is something that it's a neat thing to talk about in history, because it's very unique comparatively to like other civilizations around the world. But this is something they practiced because they believed it was required of the gods to keep the world from crashing. So their science and their culture were very closely linked to the religion. One of the things that the Mayans do get a lot of credit for, or a lot of publicity, and people know a lot about it, is the Mayan calendar, which is unique comparatively to the calendar that we use. And so the Mayan calendar itself was used for the purpose of agriculture, knowing what time of the year that certain crops would be needing to be planted and so forth. It was kind of famous back in 2012, where the Mayan calendar kind of stops at 2012, and a lot of people felt that the world was about to end or something, like they knew something was coming. For most of us rational people, we had a good laugh about that. I saw a cartoon the other day says, they rounded wrong, and it's actually 2020 that is the last year of the Mayan calendar, which is a nice joke to tell, but at the same time, not even like close to being true, most likely. So because of their calendar, it shows a great deal of understanding in astronomy. They had a great deal of understanding of mathematics to build these giant temples. They certainly had to have the mathematics to be able to do the engineering feat, so forth. And it's pretty impressive what they were able to accomplish, completely separated from the rest of the world. They primarily had a diet made of maize, which is corn, beans, and squash. Sometimes these are referred to as the Three Sisters. And the way they were planted helped keep the soil strong and balanced, so that they could have a plentiful harvest year in and year out. Essentially, they would grow the maize, and then the beans would use the stalks of the maize to be able to climb up of, if you are familiar with beans. And then squash would be at the foot of them. And because the beans themselves would put nitrogen back into the soil, as well as squash and such, then corn continued to be grown and so forth. And these became staple crops that made it one of the healthiest diets in the world at that time, only surpassed by probably the Incan civilizations, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So the civilization the Mayans themselves are going to disappear before the arrival of the Europeans. Reasons for that are likely environmental. They likely destroyed their environment enough to off balance, and then they had food shortages, and what led to eventually the dispersal of people away from these cities and back into the jungles and to the other lands and so forth. So the Mesoamerican civilization that kind of comes after them is the Mexica, or the Aztec, as they're more commonly known here in the West. And the Aztec civilization, was primarily the source of their power was the primary city of Tenochtitlan. This was a city that was founded on an island in the middle of the lake where modern-day Mexico City is today. It was one of the largest populated cities in the world at the time, roughly 200,000 strong, which doesn't seem all that big when you compare it to cities today, but back then it was one of the world's largest and most populated. So the reason why they were able to make this work, and they were able to kind of build this island nation or island city, was that they built these floating gardens known as chinapas. As you can see down here in the right-hand corner, the chinapas themselves were essentially, they piled up sticks and wood, and I'll have a little video on the chinapas in the Canvas course for this under the other helpful videos. But the chinapas themselves, they could build them as large as football fields, and they would put crops on them. They could also build houses and temples and so forth because they built them pretty strong. And this helped increase the food production that helped sustain this large populated city. And then because they built them, they had irrigation waters right there. They don't have to carry it from afar. It's all like this very self-serving system. And they can simply just build more land when they needed it. So it worked out very well. So as a result, Tenochtitlan is basically a pretty impressive city, and it's sometimes referred to as the Venice of the West. For those of you who are familiar with Venice, Italy, where you have these grand canals that make up the parts of the city, this too is similar in that sense. And you can see these large canals that allow people to move in and out of the city, which is essentially what they did. So this is an artist's rendition of what it looked like today. You will not find this anymore today because the ruins are built upon by the city of Mexico City today, or also known as Mexico District Federales, which is one of the largest cities in the world. This lake has been drained and it is gone. So there's no island of Mexico City today. So the Aztec themselves, their government was a tributary system. They essentially are going to establish dominance over Mesoamerica, and the food and the cloth, firewood, feathers, beads, jewelry that they would get, they received from these smaller city-states and villages that surrounded them. So essentially, they just either pay your tribute or else, and the or else would be the destruction of the civilization, the encapturement of the people, and that would be used for human sacrifice. Sometimes they also required that they would give them human sacrifice or bodies for human sacrifice as part of that tribute as well. So as a result, they established this indirect political dominance over these surrounding little villages and city-states themselves. They were also a theocratic rule, meaning that they had an emperor who was the ruler. He was also the divine representative of the gods, right? Similar to what the Mayans did. And culturally, there's a lot of similarities between the Mayans and the Aztecs. The land-owning nobles were the ones who specialized in military leadership. They held loyalty to the emperor, and so they helped kind of fortify his power across this region of Mesoamerica. They also had scribes and healers, craftspeople, merchants, peasants, soldiers, and slaves. This is essentially what makes up the societal order of the Aztec people. Polytheistic religion, again, human sacrifice, and women had a pretty important role as far as their value within the society and such. It's still a patriarchal society, but it is not as strongly patriarchal as what we saw in East Asia with the foot binding that was done by the Song Dynasty. So they, played a valuable role in the economics. They wove cloth. They acted as midwives. They were healers. They were merchants. So they had a number of different roles within their society. The Aztecs' decline comes with the arrival of the Europeans. The empire itself became very hard to govern. At the top of that, the surrounding villages weren't big fans of, having to pay tribute, and especially having to pay tribute in the form of human sacrifice. And so when the Europeans arrive, there are several things that happen. Number one, they bring with them smallpox, and that has a devastating effect on all the populations of Native Americans. But it is going to definitely play a role in the decline of this massive empire. And then at the same time, the Spaniards, they also have military advantage. They are on horses. They have armor that protects them from the obsidian-based swords, knives, arrows that the Aztec were carrying with them. And at the same time, the Aztec, when Hernan Cortez, who was the leader of this expedition that does end up leading to the destruction of the Aztecs, a lot of the surrounding villages are like, yeah, we would be happy to help you find what you're looking for, which was essentially gold. And it's those guys who have it, and you should go take them out and get it for yourselves. And so that's something that does happen. In a nutshell, there's a lot more complex story that goes along with that. But okay. So we're going to take a shift to another part of the Americas. This is going to be in South America, in the Andes region, essentially the western coast of South America itself. And this is the Incan Empire. So the Incan Empire itself was, made up of a lot of small city-states from a civilization. There was the Chavan. Before them, it was the Norte Chico. Cultural similarities very similar, but not a centralized ruling of empire or anything along those lines. Okay, in 1438, so not that long before the arrival of the Europeans, Pachacuti, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that 100% correct, but yes, he is going to be a ruler that helps kind of unite the empire under his rule and so forth. And so the empire itself was split into 4 provinces. Each one of them was governed by a bureaucracy and a governor who answers to the emperor. So you're talking about another big bureaucracy that helps centralize the rule and power of the emperor. This is all part of the importance that helps keep the Incan Empire a strong, powerful empire for the time that it is around. If you lived in the Incan Empire, you had to pay a tax in the form of what's called the mita system. So the mita essentially is a mandatory labor that every member of the Incan civilization must pay, at least the lower classes, and it was mandatory public service for men from age 15 to 50. And so they had to go and do labor jobs. They had to go and help plant in these state-run farms, terrace farms. They had to build the roads that I'll talk about here a little bit. But this mita system is really important to note. So if you are taking notes, if you're doing that, I would make a note now or start next to the mita system, because when we get into the Europeans will continue this system. They're going to change it for their benefit. The religion is polytheistic as well. The Incans saw the ruler as a representative of Intas, the sun god. The representative on earth was the Sapa Inca. So basically, the emperor was the representative of the sun god on earth, right? And then they did practice human worship, sacrifice, but not even close to the level of what the Aztecs, the Mayans do. But more specifically of what the Incan religion was about was ancestral veneration. They kind of worship their ancestors. This is something you saw in Chinese religions, particularly Taoism. But there's a lot of stress on the worship of the ancestors. And something that the Incans did was they mummified bodies of their rulers and kind of preserved them, even carrying their corpses, their mummified bodies into battle sometimes when they want to conquer more land. One of the things that College Board kind of mentioned is the Temple of the Sun. It's now the Santo Domingo Church. So if you can see, there's this church up here, but then the stone right here is different than what you see up here. Essentially, the Santo Domingo Church was built on the ruins of the Temple of the Sun. But basically, the foundations, this is where the dead rulers would continue to, this is kind of the centralized power of the emperors. This is where the dead rulers were mummified and kind of kept. And so this is something that is important to note as far as artifacts of the power of the emperors. It kind of lays in the ruins here of the Temple of the Sun. So as I mentioned, dead rulers were mummified, and then they continued to rule. And basically, if you were an emperor and you conquered certain parts of your land, your empire, then that continues to be yours. It doesn't become the property or the ownership of the next emperor. It's just the next emperor, if they want more land and such, they got to go conquer it themselves. Kind of an incentive there. Doing that encouraged more territorial expansion, and the Incan Empire continued to grow and grow and grow up until the time in which the Europeans arrive. Priests played a huge role as far as the religion goes in the makings of government decisions. So it's not quite a theocratic order, but it still has a whole lot of influence altogether. And I would say it's more theocratic than not, honestly. I did mention they practiced human sacrifice, but not in the same degree as the others and such. And they also had a lot of animism involved in their religion as well, basically feeling that physical elements, the rocks, the water, all this had supernatural powers. So animism, ancestral veneration are some of the more popular, faiths in the world. They're just not one of the major religions. And even the major religions have some parts of these things in them as well. So the achievements that they made, the Quipu, which was a record-keeping system. It's considered a writing system, even though it's not writing in the same sense we want, but it's a record-keeping system. And they had these giant strings that they would tie knots into, and the type of knot that they tied on those strings represented a number. And so they were able to keep track of their surplus of food and what they had stored for the winter and so forth. And so that's something that's a unique achievement, a unique thing about the Americas, is that they did have a writing system. It just happened to be in this form of the Quipu. They did terrace farming because they were living in very mountainous regions. You can see here, this picture down here, where you have very mountainous region. So in order to be able to live there and to be able to provide for an increasing population, they practiced terrace farming, cutting into the side of the mountain, these steps. And they grew potatoes, maize, and quinoa. It's kind of main crops. There are others, of course, that you could add in there. This might have been one of the healthiest, if not the healthiest diet in the world at the time. Potatoes, most people think potatoes are either from Idaho or Ireland. But all of the potatoes in the world that we typically consume, their origins come from South America and the Andes region. And then they also built the Carpe Naan, which is the Incan road system, roughly 25,000 miles worth of roads that help link all the little cities to unite this empire. It was primarily used by the government, like common people couldn't use it. But it was used by the government and the military so that they could handle uprisings and then help move armies to help conquer more territory. That is the main purpose of it. Opportunity lost, that they didn't have merchants in large numbers going along these roads. because it certainly could have helped increase the power of the Incans themselves. This is Machu Picchu, which some of you probably have seen before in the past. It's very famous, and some of you may have even been there. I don't know. But you can see some of the terrace farming right here, this terrace right here, where they would grow things. But the Machu Picchu was largely basically a vacation getaway for the emperors. And then you had people who live here too. But it's fairly well preserved because the European explorers did not really discover it. And archaeologists do with it largely intact. There's still, it's not as well built as it once was, but that's what time does to structures that are human-made. The decline of the Incan Empire is very similar to the decline of the Aztecs. There were, unfortunately, in the midst of a civil war, right as the arrival of the Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro shows up. And Francisco Pizarro, similar to Hernando Cortez, is looking for gold and riches. And the Incans had certainly had plenty. They had gold, they had silver, they had many other riches as well. And so between his arrival, smallpox, the Civil War going on, the Spanish come in and are able to destroy the Incan civilization. They're even, come in and they basically reassert the authority of the Mita system to use the people who remain to help extract more gold and especially silver. And we'll talk about that in a later date. So North America, there's also the Chaco Canyon, which is kind of found in southwestern United States, as well as parts of Mexico. But this was the center of the Pueblo civilization. It was a very dry climate. It required the transportation and storage of water in order to survive. And then, from there, they were able to build some pretty impressive structures using stone and clay, some of which still are around today. The ruins are still around today, including, this one right here, which, was able to house multi-level houses, multi-storied houses, which is quite an impressive feat, considering the engineering was not necessarily as advanced as we saw in Afro-Eurasia. Mesa Verde, another example of a city where the Pueblo culture centered around. You can find that in modern-day Colorado, very close to the Utah border. If you're looking for something to do, well, Labor Day weekend's this weekend, so you're all not going to be able to do that. But Mesa Verde, it's really impressive, and you can actually go into the structure and walk around as long as you're careful, obviously. But that's something of a very well preserved because it's right under this cliff dwelling that's protected from the elements for many years. Then we finished off with Cahokia, another major city that was built. This was the centralized power, the powerful city-state of the Mississippian culture. And this sometimes are referred to as the mound builder civilization. So they built these giant structures using nothing but earthworks. And it takes a number of, engineering feat to be able to do this as well as they do. And at the same time, they're doing it with no machinery at all. Everything's basically, all the dirt's being carried by baskets, by hand. So lots of intensive labor to be able to build these pretty impressive earthwork structures. And you can go there today and you'll still see the remnants of them. They're not as clearly defined as you see in this picture in this artist rendition, but they certainly do stand out on the landscape, and you can tell that they're handmade. This civilization is kind of starts around 1050 CE. Its height's around 1350. When the Europeans arrived, they're kind of in a downcline, and then the arrival of the European smallpox and other diseases certainly help wipe out any remains of what the Mississippian culture once was. They had a very rigid social structure. They had chiefs, they had priests, they had soldiers, farmers, and slaves. It's been very similar to what we're seeing in other places as well, right? Socials, the society itself, there is some evidence to support the idea that they had a maternal society, meaning that the women, instead of a patriarchal society, they have a more maternal society, where properties pass through the woman's side of the family, which is unique. Can you compare it to other places in the world, including East Asia? There is a lot of decline, or the disagreement with the decline of where it started. Some say it's when the disease is showing up from Europe. Some say that they're already experiencing crop failure prior to the arrival of the Europeans. So there's still debate on that, but we can only gain so much information from archaeological evidence that's left behind. So here we go. That is the Americas in a nutshell. And you can see, you know, their empires were not as great and grand as what we see in Afro-Eurasia, but they did make a lot of achievements and certainly were able to construct pretty complex civilizations prior to the arrival of the Europeans themselves. Okay, so again, essential question is, to what extent is state building in the Americas similar to those in Asia? So think about that. Make sure you're using strong examples from both Asia and the Americas, and make sure you submit it through Canvas. Other than that, I hope everyone finds you healthy and safe, and I will see you later.